This speckled glaze effect is made by adding multicolored fragments of glaze to a different colored base glaze. If you just added dried fragments of one glaze to another, it would melt into it and you wouldn't get speckles. So there's an intermediate step known as sintering, which is essentially the glaze equivalent of bisque firing and can be done at the same temperature as bisque firing with certain glazes. In this video, I'll walk you from start to finish through the process of making these multicolored speckles and give a couple of recipes suitable for cone 010 to 06 bisque firings and highlight some of the ways in which it can go wrong. You might already have seen speckled clays and glazes. With clays, it tends to be granular forms of the colorants that we might use for other things. So you can get larger chunks of materials that contain iron or manganese, and these will give you brown specks that will actually bleed through the clay a little bit. Some pre-made glazes or glaze recipes will use these more granular forms of the brown colorants for a brown speckled glaze. But most of the commercial speckled glazes use a different technique to make the speckles multicolored. In fact, some of the glazes that first got me hooked on ceramics were the Mako speckled glazes. At the time I was firing to earthenware temperatures and a lot of the glazes can be quite flat, but by adding the coloured speckles they were making some really interesting patterns at the lower temperatures. The process of making the sintered speckles is actually really simple. You mix up a suitable glaze, leave it to dry, break it up into small chunks, put it through a bisque firing and then add it to another glaze or to a clay. Of course, there's a bit more complexity hidden within those instructions, so I'll go through point by point and discuss some of the things to be aware of. The first step is selecting the glaze you're going to use for this. I actually have 3 separate recipes using slightly different ingredients that I have used to fire pieces to around cone 6 and in cone 06 to 010 bisque firings. So those are a good starting point if you don't have an existing recipe in mind, and they are linked in the description. You can also use glazes that you already have mixed up, and this can be a great way to finish off a glaze or make use of a glaze test that you're not going further with. You can dry it out and attempt to sinter it. The downside to this is that each glaze will have a different sintering temperature, and you have to find the sweet spot between not getting it hot enough for it to melt at all and getting it so hot that it starts to actually melt, become liquid and fuse together. If the glaze has been sintered correctly, it will come out of the bisque firing looking very similar to how it went in, maybe with a slight colour change, but still as separate fragments. But if you add those fragments to water, they won't break down. They will stay as they are and just sit in the water. If you've got an existing glaze you want to use up, it's always worth bisque firing a little bit of it to see if it's suitable. But if you're starting from scratch, I would recommend picking an existing recipe that's known to work. The next step is drying it out. If you're not in a hurry, you can just pour it into a tray and leave it for a week. If you want to speed the process up, you can pour it onto a plaster slab, or you can get an absolutely useless machine like this crepe maker, which alternates between not doing anything and boiling the glaze so it splashes off of it. I would not recommend the latter. I bought this one to find out if it would work for this process, and I'm using it now because of the sunk cost fallacy. But either way, once your glaze is dry, you need to break it up and sieve it. My process for breaking it up is very simple. I just put it in a pot and crush it. And to be honest, anything that works would be absolutely fine for this part. The size of sieve that you use to filter out the pieces can quite dramatically change the end result, with a finer sieve giving you very fine speckles and a larger sieve giving you fewer but larger specks in your glaze. This is something to experiment with to find out what you find works best for you, but I find that anything smaller than a 40 mesh sieve will be a fairly fine speckle, and my larger sieve is just a regular kitchen sieve that probably filters out to about the size of a millimeter, and that gives quite effective large speckles which aren't excessively large. To bisque fire them, I just put them into a clay bowl which has not been glazed. It can be bisque fired before you use it, or it can be greenware when you put it in, doesn't really matter. In order for it all to become sintered, the heat has to be able to reach the centre, so you either want a fairly thin layer, maybe a centimetre or 2 thick, or if you're going to heap it up, you need to have a slow enough firing that the middle will have received enough heat by the end. If you're going to throw a piece specifically for sintering, I would recommend a flat plate with a centimetre or 2 lip around the outside so that you can have a nice level flat surface. But if you've got scrap plates or bowls, this can be a good use for them without having to throw anything specific. My recipes are for a cone 010 to 06 Bisque, which is around 950 to 1000 C, but if you're using different recipes, you'll have to test to find what the correct temperature is, and if you use a different Bisque temperature, I would recommend adapting any recipes you do use to suit your Bisque temperature rather than requiring an entirely separate firing just for sintering. Once they're fired, you want to check that they don't dissolve into water. If they do, they haven't been fired enough. This could be as simple as them being piled too high, so spreading them out and refiring them would work. It could be that the glaze is not suitable for your Bisque temperature, in which case you might have to either reassess the glaze you're using or fire it at a separate hotter temperature. Once you've got successfully sintered fragments of a size that you're happy with, you need to add them to a different glaze. They can be added to a dipping, pouring, or brushing glaze, but whatever you do, they will fall out of suspension faster than a normal glaze. So I would recommend frequently mixing the glaze back up to get them evenly spread out through the glaze. In my experience of dipping glazes like this, you can generally dip a couple of mugs before it noticeably affects the results, but I personally use my cordless drill to mix up the glaze between every single mug just to make sure they all get the same application. You can use all the same colorant you would in a conventional glaze, but there is quite a big advantage to using stains here, which is that they're quite refractory and come in a huge range of colors, which means that they hold their speckle shape better, and you can specify exactly what color you want the speckle to be, which is a little bit harder with oxides. On the flip side, if you're going to add your speckles to clay, then I would recommend using oxides, particularly the fluxing, powerful oxides, rather than stains. This is because the speckles will have a thin layer of clay above them. A colorant like iron, manganese, or cobalt can bleed through that thin layer of clay and deliver the color to the surface, whereas if you use a stain, the color will just be hidden underneath the surface. So for clay, use oxides. For glazes, use either, but you'll get a more neat color spec with stains. With regards to what you use for the base glaze, you can have a clearer base glaze and then you'll see more of the specks, or you can have a more opaque base glaze, in which case some of the specks will be more clearly visible at the surface and the ones behind that will be slightly more faded back. Either effect can work quite well. Another consideration for the base glaze is how fluid it is. A more stiff base glaze, like the one I tend to use, which is the First 5 or Freedom 5 glossy base, is quite a static glaze and the specks will stay where you put them. Whereas a more fluid glaze will have the specks run down the piece and make streaks. Again, both effects work quite well, but you've got to pick the right one for the effect that you want. There are near infinite possible combinations of base and speckle colour, and definitely no right answers, so anything goes. But as we head into winter, if you wanted one suggestion that I'm currently testing, is using 10% of a zirconium-based opacifier, so zirconium silica or Zircosil. Add 10% of that to your speckle mix, mix that into a fairly stiff, clear or coloured glaze for a snowflake pattern. Another use for the sintering technique that doesn't involve the speckles is to sinter one glaze onto a piece before applying a second. This fuses the glaze to the piece and prevents the glaze from crawling, and can allow you to do techniques such as water resist, where you partially dunk the piece in water to get an uneven deposit of the second glaze, and the water will not wash off the first glaze as it has been sintered onto the piece. This does require a second firing and won't work with all glazes, but in some cases it can be a really useful technique and makes the most of the ability to sinter glazes in a bisque firing. Both sintering techniques will open up the range of possible glaze results you can get, and it's worth knowing about even if it's not something you use regularly. If it's a technique you've tried, please let me know in the comments how it's gone for you. This is a technique that I've posted about fairly regularly over the years, but I've never really done a fully comprehensive video like this. It was more experimentation and learning as I went. So hopefully this guide will make it as simple as possible to get started with this technique. That is a really fun way of using glazes slightly differently to how we normally do.